The Hawaiian night glittered with lights and laughter. My ex-husband, Ethan Reynolds, raised his glass, mocking me in front of everyone, his mistress Vanessa clinging to his arm. The crowd laughed, certain I was defeated. But then Liam Carter, the billionaire who believed in me when no one else did, stepped to my side. I smiled because Ethan had no idea this beach was no longer his stage. Tonight it was mine, and he was about to fall. The warm lights draped over the beach, blending with the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore. I stood just beyond the crowd, the scent of salt water and tropical flowers filling the air. And there he was, Ethan Reynolds, my ex-husband. His hand rested arrogantly on Vanessa Moore's waist, his smirk sharpened as he spotted me standing in the distance. He raised his glass high, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Look at her. Some things never change." A ripple of laughter followed, sharp and cruel, slicing through the warm Hawaiian night. My chest tightened, but I didn't flinch. Liam Carter, tall and steady beside me, tightened his grip around my hand. I didn't need to look at him to feel the calm strength radiating from him, grounding me in this moment. I locked my eyes on Ethan, letting every bitter memory of betrayal rise to the surface. In my mind, I could still hear my voice whispering, almost like a vow I had carried for years. "He doesn't know it yet, but tonight on this very beach, I will take back everything he stole from me." Liam leaned closer, his deep voice low enough for only me to hear. "Ready, Olivia?" I turned my head slightly and smiled, small but steady, more than ever. The crowd buzzed with music and laughter as Ethan paraded Vanessa through the sea of wealthy guests, each one more eager than the next to fawn over his charm. I remembered this Ethan all too well. The polished smile, the confident laugh, the man who once convinced the world and me that he was untouchable. Vanessa glanced over her shoulder at me, her red lips curling into a mocking smirk. I could almost hear her thoughts without a word spoken. "Look at her. She doesn't belong here." I held her gaze for a moment, then slowly let my eyes drift past her back to Ethan, because she was nothing more than a shadow clinging to a man who was already doomed. Liam's thumb brushed against the back of my hand, a simple gesture, but it steadied me. He didn't need to tell me I was in control. I could feel it. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being laughed at. Tonight was mine, and Ethan just didn't know it yet. Ethan raised his glass again, laughing louder this time, making sure everyone around could see his performance. This beach, this party, this entire stage had been built for his ego, and I intended to turn it into the very place he would lose it all. I stepped forward, the sand soft beneath my heels, and the crowd seemed to part instinctively as Liam moved beside me. I could feel the stares now, the whispers starting to ripple through the air. "Olivia Parker. She's here, and not alone." Ethan saw it too. His smirk faltered for just a split second. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the brief crack in that smug mask he wore. Vanessa squeezed his arm, her smile growing tighter, her fingers digging into him like she was trying to remind him to keep control. Liam leaned in again, his voice warm and calm against the hum of the music. "Breathe. He's already losing, he just doesn't know it yet." I drew in a deep breath and held it for a moment. The waves, the laughter, the distant music, all blurred into the background. All I could see was Ethan. I remembered every word he'd thrown at me, every cruel laugh, every look that told me I was less than him. And for the first time, I didn't feel small. I took another step forward, my heels sinking slightly into the sand, and Liam matched my pace, his presence unshakable. The crowd shifted, a curious hush falling over them. Even the music felt softer, or maybe it was just that I could hear the blood pounding in my ears as I closed the distance. Ethan's smile returned, but now it was sharp and defensive. He tilted his head slightly, lifting his chin as if daring me to approach. Vanessa glanced between us, her smugness fading ever so slightly, as if she could sense the shift in the air. I didn't rush. Every step was deliberate. I wanted him to feel it, to see me coming, and know he couldn't stop it. By the time I reached the edge of the crowd, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped his glass, just a little too tightly. Liam stopped beside me and placed a hand at the small of my back. His touch was steady, a silent reminder that I was no longer standing alone. I lifted my chin and met Ethan's gaze head on. For a second, neither of us moved. Then his smirk twisted into something uglier, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You really couldn't stay away, could you, Olivia?" There it was, the arrogance, the same voice that once made me feel powerless. But not tonight. Tonight, I didn't have to answer. My silence was louder than anything I could say, and I watched as the first flicker of unease crossed his face. I turned my head slightly toward Liam. "Ready," I whispered. Liam smiled down at me, the kind of smile that didn't just promise victory. It promised the end of Ethan Reynolds. And for the first time since I had stepped onto this beach, I felt the weight of the past start to shift. Tonight was only beginning. Seattle, 2015. The air was cold and sharp that evening when I first saw Ethan Reynolds at a business conference downtown. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by people who laughed at every word he spoke. He had that kind of confidence that pulled you in before you even realized it. I remember thinking he looked like a man who had already figured out the world. When he noticed me across the room, his smile was effortless. He walked over, his hand outstretched, his voice smooth. "Olivia Parker. Right? I have heard about your work at Crestwood Marketing. You have a reputation for turning impossible accounts around." I felt my cheeks warm. No one had ever introduced me like that before. For a moment, it felt like he saw me in a way no one else ever had. We spent hours talking that night, not just about work, but about dreams and plans. He told me about his ambitions, how he wanted to build his own real estate firm, and how Hawaii was the crown jewel of his vision. I listened, drawn in by his determination, by the way he spoke, as if success was not a question, but a promise. My mother Grace adored him the first time she met him. He was polite, charming, and attentive in a way that made her smile at me across the dinner table as if to say, "This is the one." Even my father Richard, who rarely spoke much at family dinners, told me Ethan was a man with direction. It was easy to believe it then. I wanted to believe it. We married within a year. In the beginning, everything felt like the fairy tale I had convinced myself it would be. Ethan bought me flowers every week. He left notes on the kitchen counter before his early meetings. We went on late-night drives just to talk about the future. But little by little, those gestures began to fade, replaced by something colder. It started small. Comments about my wardrobe, jokes about how much time I spent on work, then suggestions that felt less like advice and more like rules. "Maybe you should dress more like Vanessa from the firm. Maybe you should stop staying so late at the office. You do not want people to think you care more about your job than your family." At first I told myself it was concern, that he wanted the best for me. But concern does not make you feel small. Concern does not strip away the parts of you that once made you proud of who you were. When I was promoted at Crestwood Marketing, it should have been the happiest moment of my career. Instead, Ethan barely smiled. He poured himself a drink and said, "Well, I hope you do not forget who is really keeping this roof over your head." The words stung, but I brushed them aside. I told myself marriage was about compromise, that every couple had their rough edges. But then came the rumor. I still remember the meeting when my boss called me into his office, the heavy look on his face. "Olivia, I do not know what is going on between you and that client, but this is not the kind of scandal we can afford." I could not breathe. I tried to explain. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the look in his eyes told me he had already made up his mind. By the end of that week, I was out of a job. It was only later that I learned where the rumor started. Ethan had been the one who whispered it to Vanessa, who passed it along until it reached my boss. When I confronted him, he did not even bother to deny it. "I was protecting you, Olivia. You work too much. Now you can finally focus on us." I remember standing there in our kitchen, my hands trembling, staring at the man I thought I knew. That was the moment I realized Ethan did not love me for who I was. He loved me for how easy I was to control. He started traveling to Hawaii more after that. He would come home with tanned skin, expensive watches, and stories about the high-profile parties he attended. He called it networking. I called it an escape. Every time he mentioned Hawaii, he spoke about it like it was another world, a place where only winners belonged. One night, after a long dinner where he barely looked at me, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Maybe one day you will understand, Olivia. Hawaii is not for people like you." The words settled in my chest like a stone. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had gone from the confident woman who ran entire campaigns at Crestwood to the silent wife of a man who seemed to enjoy watching me shrink. I tried to hold on. I told myself that if I worked harder, if I became softer, quieter, maybe I could bring back the man I fell in love with. But every time Ethan came home from Hawaii, he was further away, like the distance between us was growing mile by mile with every flight he took. One evening I caught him standing on the balcony with his phone. His voice was low, but I heard the laughter. It was not for me. When I asked who he was talking to, he smiled like I was being silly. Just business. Always business. I wanted to believe him. But deep down, I already knew. The night that broke me came not long after. Ethan returned from another trip, his suitcase barely unpacked, when he looked at me across the room and said, "You should really try to be more like Vanessa. She knows how to stand beside a man without getting in his way." I stood there frozen while he walked past me, his cologne lingering in the air, like a ghost of the man I once loved. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the woman looking back. And for the first time, I realized Hawaii was not just the place Ethan ran to. It was the place he left me behind. I gripped the sink, my knuckles white, and whispered to myself, "One day I will go there too." Not as the woman he humiliated, but as the woman who will watch him fall. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds when I heard my phone buzz on the nightstand. It was a message from Ethan. "Family dinner tonight. Be there. No explanations, no kindness. Just another order I was expected to obey." That evening I walked into my mother's house with a knot in my stomach. Grace was bustling around the kitchen as usual, her voice warm but clipped, as if she already sensed the tension in the air. My father Richard sat silently at the table, his eyes buried in the newspaper, avoiding the storm that always seemed to follow Ethan wherever he went. Emily was there too, sitting nervously with her hands folded in her lap, avoiding my gaze. Ethan arrived late, his presence filling the room like a shadow. He greeted my parents smoothly, kissing my mother on the cheek, shaking my father's hand, before settling into a chair with that arrogant ease of his. He looked at me and smirked as if daring me to challenge him in front of my family. I stayed silent, my hands curling tightly into fists under the table. Dinner began, and for a few minutes there was nothing but the clinking of silverware and forced conversation. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He didn't bother to hide it, didn't even lower his voice as he read the message that lit up the screen. But I saw it. Emily. The name burned in my vision. My chest tightened. He laughed quietly, a sound that cut straight through me. I reached across the table, snatched the phone out of his hand before I even realized what I was doing. "Olivia, what the hell are you doing?" His voice was sharp, commanding, but I didn't hear him. All I saw was the message. It wasn't business. It wasn't innocent. My eyes scanned the words and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. Emily gasped, her face going pale. She shot up from her chair. "Olivia, it's not what you think." My hand shook. My own sister. The room blurred for a moment, my mother's voice breaking through in a panicked whisper, but I barely heard her. I turned to Ethan, my voice low and shaking. "How long?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, unbothered, his smirk cruel. "Don't pretend like you didn't know Olivia. She came to me." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "That's a lie. He's twisting it." I looked at her. My little sister who used to share a bedroom with me, who used to cry on my shoulder after every heartbreak. My throat felt raw. "You let him do this to us?" Grace stepped in, her hands trembling. "Olivia, stop this, please. We can talk calmly." But there was no calm left in me. The betrayal was too deep, too sharp. I dropped Ethan's phone onto the table with a loud crack, the screen splintering slightly on impact. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I walked out without another word, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Behind me, I heard Emily crying, my mother calling after me, and Ethan's low chuckle like the final twist of a knife. That night, I packed my bags. I couldn't bear to be in the same house, the same city, breathing the same air as them. I went to a small hotel downtown and stared at the ceiling until dawn. By morning, I had already called a lawyer. Ethan didn't fight the divorce. He didn't need to. He had already stripped me of everything. He got the house, the car, most of our savings. I walked away with nothing but a suitcase and a name that had been dragged through the mud by the man I once trusted most. But I wasn't done with him. Not yet. 2 weeks later, I heard about the party. A luxury beachside event in Maui, hosted by Ethan himself to celebrate his company's new expansion. It was plastered all over social media. Ethan smiling like a king, Vanessa on his arm. Emily standing in the background like a ghost trying to disappear. I stared at those photos until my vision blurred, my fingers digging into the edges of my phone. Something inside me hardened that night. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was furious. I made myself a promise. One day I would walk into one of his glittering parties, not as the broken woman he left behind, but as the storm that would take everything from him. And I held on to that promise like a weapon. The next morning I met my lawyer, signed the divorce papers, and walked out into the chilly Seattle air with nothing but my determination. As I stood there on the courthouse steps, I whispered to myself, he thinks Hawaii is his kingdom. Then Hawaii will be where I burn it all down. For the first time in a long time, I felt something sharp and steady in my chest. Not fear, not grief, resolve. And I knew this was only the beginning. Seattle winters had a way of settling deep in your bones. The chill followed me up the narrow staircase of my tiny apartment, the kind of place that smelled faintly of old wood and rain-soaked pavement. It was not much, but it was mine. After everything Ethan had taken that mattered more than I could explain. I was sitting at my small kitchen table with bills spread out in front of me when the knock came. Madison Cole let herself in without waiting for an invitation, the same way she had since college. She carried a folder under her arm, her dark hair tied back, her expression sharp and deliberate. She dropped the folder in front of me. Olivia, I think I just found the thing that can break him. I frowned and pushed the bills aside. What is this? She flipped it open and slid a single document toward me. It was a lab report stamped confidential. My stomach tightened as my eyes traced the words. DNA test. Ethan Reynolds. Probability of paternity, 0. I looked up at her, my hands trembling. Madison, where did you get this? She leaned against the counter, arms folded. A friend of mine in legal records owed me a favor. Ethan has been hiding this for years. If this comes out in court, he is done. I stared down at the paper, a cold rush spreading through me. For so long I had felt powerless, cornered by Ethan's money and influence. But this was different. This was a weapon. I pushed back from the table and stood pacing the length of the kitchen. My heart was hammering. Do you know what this means? Madison's mouth curved into the kind of smile I had not seen from her in months. It means you finally have leverage. I gripped the edge of the counter and let out a shaky laugh that felt almost foreign. I had spent so long drowning in anger and humiliation that the idea of fighting back felt unreal. The paper in my hand was real. The numbers were real. And so was the fire building in my chest. I turned to Madison. I am not just going to file this in court. I am going to make sure the whole world sees it. Her eyebrows rose. Olivia, are you sure you want to do this publicly? I nodded without hesitation. He humiliated me in front of everyone. He made me feel small in my own life. No more. Madison studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right. If you are going to war, I am in. The days that followed felt different. I started waking up earlier, forcing myself to run along the waterfront, even when the cold cut through my lungs. I updated my resume, reached out to contacts from my old career in marketing, and for the first time in a long time, I saw my reflection in the mirror and recognized her. One night, Madison came over with takeout and spread more documents across my table. "I think we need a strategy," she said between bites of noodles. "Ethan's not going to roll over. He's going to fight like hell." I sat down across from her and glanced at the papers. "He can fight all he wants. I have nothing left to lose." Madison smirked. "Then let's make him lose everything." We worked late into the night, building timelines, drafting statements, listing every person Ethan had screwed over who might be willing to testify. Each piece of the puzzle strengthened my resolve. There were moments late at night when doubt crept in. When I thought about my mother, Grace, who still called Ethan polite and misunderstood. When I thought about Emily, my sister who hadn't spoken to me since the night I walked out. But then I would remember Ethan's voice dripping with disdain, telling me Hawaii wasn't for people like me. And I would see it in my mind as clear as day. That same beach, that same man. And me walking in not as his victim, but as the storm that would tear his world apart. One evening, after hours of digging, Madison closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. "You know, there is one more thing. Ethan is planning a massive event in Maui in a few months. His company's expansion party. Every major investor will be there." I looked up from the stack of papers. "Good. Then we will give them a show they will never forget." Madison grinned, raising her drink in a mock toast. "To the fall of Ethan Reynolds." I clinked my glass against hers, my hand steady for the first time in years. That night after she left, I sat alone in the quiet of my apartment, holding that DNA report in my hands. I thought about all the nights I cried over Ethan, all the times I let him win. I folded the paper neatly and slid it into a folder labeled with one word: justice. Then I placed it on my desk and stared at it until the room blurred. For the first time, I felt like I had a weapon sharp enough to cut through every lie Ethan had ever told. And I knew exactly where I would use it: Hawaii. The conference room at the Skyline Business Forum was crowded with sharp suits and sharper smiles. I stood near the back, clutching a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, wondering why I had let Madison talk me into coming. She said I needed to be here. She said if I was serious about taking Ethan down, I had to start moving in the same world he did. I was debating whether to slip out quietly when I saw him. Liam Carter. He was standing near the stage, his presence magnetic even from across the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him. People surrounded him, hanging on to every word he spoke, but he didn't look impressed by any of it. There was something about the way he carried himself that made it clear he didn't need to prove anything. I turned away, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but when I looked back, his eyes were already on me. He didn't look away. He didn't give me the dismissive glance I'd grown so used to. Instead, he walked toward me, moving through the crowd like he had already decided I was the only person he wanted to talk to. "You look like you would rather be anywhere but here." His voice was warm, steady, and it caught me off guard. I gave a small laugh. "Guilty." He smiled, the kind of smile that was confident without being arrogant. "Liam Carter," he said, offering his hand. "Olivia Parker." He didn't just shake my hand. He held my gaze in a way that made me feel seen, and I hated how much I needed that. Madison appeared then, grinning like she had orchestrated the whole thing. "I told you two should meet." Liam raised an eyebrow at her, amused, then turned his attention back to me. "So what brings you here, Olivia?" I hesitated. I could have lied. I could have said I was here for networking, for work, for anything other than what was true. But instead, I told him. I told him about Ethan, about the betrayal, about the DNA report sitting in my apartment like a loaded weapon. Liam listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but not cold. When I finished, he nodded once, like he had already been waiting for me to say it. "If you want to win, you need a stage big enough for him to fall from." I stared at him. "And you think Hawaii is that stage?" He didn't hesitate. "His company's expansion gala will be in Maui. Every investor, every journalist, every person who's ever believed in him will be there. That is where you end this. I had imagined revenge in quiet moments. I had pictured courtrooms and whispered gossip, and maybe if I was lucky, headlines that would ruin Ethan. But this was different. This was public. This was devastating. And you are going to help me do that, I asked. Liam's smile deep and sharp, but certain. No. I am going to make sure you cannot lose. The next day he introduced me to David Foster. David was older, calm, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he didn't need to. He flipped through the DNA report and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. This is solid. If we push this to court, we will corner him. But if we are smart, we can do more than that. Liam stood beside me, his presence steady. We will make sure the world sees who Ethan really is. For the first time, I felt something that almost resembled hope. The weeks that followed were a blur of late nights and endless planning. David mapped out legal strategies, while Madison dug through financial records, finding cracks in Ethan's empire I didn't even know existed. Liam provided resources that made doors open without a fight. And me, I learned to stop flinching every time Ethan's name was mentioned. One evening after another long day of strategizing, Liam walked me to my car. The sky was fading into deep blue city lights, reflecting in the windows around us. You are not the same woman who sat in that conference hall, he said quietly. I tilted my head at him. And who am I now? His eyes didn't waver. Someone about to take back everything that was stolen from her. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because for the first time in years I believed it. When I drove home that night, the DNA report sat on the passenger seat next to me, and I couldn't help but glance at it again. Hawaii wasn't just going to be Ethan's stage anymore. It was going to be mine. The following week, David filed the lawsuit in the Honolulu courthouse. I watched as he placed the signed documents on the clerk's desk, his calm demeanor unshaken, while mine was a mix of relief and adrenaline. This was the first move. The shot across Ethan's carefully polished bow. By the next morning, it was everywhere. News outlets ran the story of a pending paternity case against Ethan Reynolds, citing anonymous legal sources. Samuel Price, a relentless investigative journalist, published an explosive piece not only confirming the case, but also hinting at a deeper look into Ethan's financial dealings. It was brutal, public, and exactly what I needed. Ethan's response was immediate. He called me that night. I didn't answer, but his voicemail was full of venom. You think you can embarrass me, Olivia? You're nothing. You always were. Enjoy your little game while it lasts. I deleted it without hesitation. Madison showed up at my apartment later with takeout and her laptop. She was grinning like she'd just witnessed a miracle. He is bleeding, Olivia. His stock dropped 3% today. Investors are nervous. And wait until Samuel releases part 2. I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension in my shoulders ease for the first time in weeks. Good. Let him feel it. But Ethan wasn't finished. 2 days later, his face was plastered across every business channel. He stood on a stage at a press conference, his arm possessively around Vanessa, his smile smug as ever. He dismissed the lawsuit as a desperate stunt. He called me a pathetic woman clinging to the men who could save her. And then he announced it. The party. The words felt almost unreal when I heard them. Ethan stood there in front of the cameras, declaring that he would host what he called the event of the century in Maui. Every powerful name in his circle would be there, he promised. It was a blatant attempt to humiliate me, to turn his world into a stage where I was the punchline. I stared at the TV, fury boiling in my chest. He had just given me exactly what I needed. Liam called that night. His voice was steady, low, and controlled. He's panicking. That's why he's doing this. He thinks this party will save him. I smiled, the kind of smile I didn't recognize in myself before. Then let him build it. There was a pause. And we will let him tear it down himself, Liam finished. In the weeks that followed, the plan sharpened. David moved forward with the legal filings, while Samuel kept publishing one damning piece of evidence after another. Each article chipped away at Ethan's facade, exposing secret accounts, questionable deals, and unpaid settlements that had been buried for years. Madison was in her element, compiling everything, mapping out timelines and connections on my living room wall, until it looked like a war room. I watched it all with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. For so long, Ethan had been untouchable. Now, for the first time, he was trapped, and he didn't even know it. One evening, as we sat around the table surrounded by stacks of files, Liam leaned back in his chair and studied me. "You are not afraid of him anymore." I met his gaze and shook my head. "No, I want him to be afraid of me." A rare smile touched his lips. "Then let's make sure he is." That night I stayed up late staring at the wall covered in notes, photographs, and documents. Ethan's world was unraveling thread by thread, and I was the one pulling it apart. The image of Maui came to mind again, the golden beaches, the glittering lights of the kind of party Ethan lived for. Only this time it was different. I saw myself there standing tall while he realized in front of everyone that his reign was over. Ethan thought Maui would be his stage. He had no idea he had just built mine. The rain tapped against my apartment window when I heard the knock. It was late, and for a moment I thought it might be Madison or Liam, but when I opened the door, I froze. Emily stood there. Her hair was damp from the weather, her eyes red and swollen, her hands twisting nervously at the hem of her coat. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, her voice trembling. "Olivia, I am sorry. I was stupid." I leaned against the doorframe, my chest tight. Memories of that night at my mother's house, the betrayal and her silence all came rushing back. I wanted to slam the door, but I didn't. Instead, I stared at her, forcing the words out evenly. "What do you want, Emily?" She took a shaky step forward, clutching her coat tighter. "I want to fix this. I want to help you." I laughed softly, bitterly. "You cannot fix what you destroyed." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know, but I can stand with you. I can help you end him." The rawness in her voice stopped me. For the first time, I saw her not as the sister who betrayed me, but as someone who had been caught in Ethan's web, just like I had been. I exhaled slowly. "You do not need my forgiveness, Emily. You need to see him fall." She nodded quickly, wiping her tears. "Then let me, please." I stepped aside, letting her in. She looked around my apartment at the wall, covered in documents, financial records, photographs of Ethan with his fake smile. It was a battlefield. She turned to me and whispered, "He really hurt you." "He hurt all of us," I said. Later that night, Emily sat at my table while Madison arrived with a stack of new files. When she saw Emily, she froze, but I lifted a hand. "She is here to help." Madison raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. She simply dropped the files on the table and said, "Then she better be ready." The next few days were a blur. David worked nonstop, digging deeper into Ethan's finances. Madison traced every transaction until she found a trail of offshore accounts. Samuel Price prepared his next big story, one that would dismantle what little reputation Ethan had left. Through it all, Emily stayed. She made coffee, sorted files, and read through the evidence in stunned silence. I caught her staring at one photo of Ethan with Vanessa at some charity event, her jaw tight. "I thought he loved me," she said quietly. I didn't answer. I knew that pain too well. One evening while Liam was reviewing documents with David, Emily turned to me. "I am going to Hawaii with you." I looked at her. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her expression firm. "I need to see him fall, and I need to prove to myself that I am not the same person who let him win." Something in my chest eased. For the first time, I believed she meant it. Later that night, Liam pulled me aside. He studied Emily from across the room, then turned to me. "Do you trust her?" I hesitated, then nodded. "I do not know if I forgive her, but I trust her to hate him enough." Liam's mouth curved in a faint smile. "That might be enough." The following morning, Ethan went on television again, full of arrogance and fury. He called me pathetic, claimed I was desperate for attention, and promised that his party in Maui would be the grandest stage imaginable. I watched the broadcast with Emily standing beside me. When it ended, she looked at me and whispered, "He thinks he has already won." "Good," I replied. "Let him." Emily gave a small, almost broken laugh. Then she reached out and squeezed my hand. I am with you, Olivia. For the first time in years, I squeezed her hand back. As the sun set outside my window, I turned to look at the wall of evidence one more time. Every piece of it led to Maui. Every single step we had taken was driving Ethan closer to the edge, and he didn't even realize it. And this time, I wasn't the only one pulling him there. Emily was standing beside me, and that made me even stronger. Dinner at my parents' house felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering over Seattle that night. The table was set, the smell of roast chicken filling the air, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Grace moved around the kitchen pretending everything was normal. Richard sat at the head of the table silent, his face unreadable. Emily sat next to me, her hands clenched in her lap. When we began eating, my mother broke the silence. Olivia, you need to stop this madness. Drop the lawsuit. Forget the trip to Hawaii. It's not worth destroying this family. I put my fork down and looked straight at her. This isn't revenge, Mom. This is about the truth. Grace's eyes flashed with anger. Truth. She glanced at Emily. What good is truth if it tears us apart? Emily stiffened, but I spoke before she could. What tore us apart wasn't the truth. It was the lies Ethan fed us for years. My mother's lips tightened. You sound just like him when you talk like this. Obsessed. Bitter. Emily's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. No, Mom. Enough. Olivia's right. You keep defending him because it's easier than admitting he used all of us. Grace's eyes widened in shock. Emily, sit down right now. Emily's voice cracked, but she didn't sit. No. I let him play me. I let him use me to hurt her. I won't keep pretending anymore. I'm going to Hawaii with Olivia, and you'll see for yourself who Ethan really is. The room went silent. My mother stared at Emily like she didn't recognize her. Then she turned to me, her voice trembling. You're dragging her into this. I met her gaze calm but unyielding. No, Mom, she's walking in on her own. From the end of the table, my father finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and it cut through the room like a knife. Let her go, Grace. We all turned to look at him. He had barely said a word all evening, but now he leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me. Richard's jaw tightened, then he gave me a single nod. It was small, but it was enough. Grace looked between us, her hands trembling. She didn't say another word. In that quiet, Ethan's name lit up my mother's phone on the counter. She picked it up instinctively, her voice sharp as she answered. Hello, Ethan. I could hear his smug laugh from where I sat. Put me on speaker. Grace hesitated, but before she could refuse, Ethan's voice carried through the room. So this is the family meeting I've been hearing about. Tell Olivia she's embarrassing herself. And Emily, too, if she's dumb enough to follow her. Emily's hands balled into fists, but I didn't look away from the phone. I leaned closer, my voice steady and cold. Tell him yourself, Emily. Emily glared at the phone, her voice shaking, but fierce. I'm not on your side anymore. There was a pause on the line. Then Ethan's laugh, sharp and cruel. You'll come crawling back, both of you. After Maui, everyone will see who you really are, Olivia. You're a joke. I reached for the phone, my fingers tightening around it. See you in Maui, Ethan. I ended the call without waiting for his reply. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked at me like I was a stranger. Emily sat back down, her hands still trembling, but her chin held high. And Richard? My father simply nodded again, slow and deliberate, like a quiet vow that he was with me, even if he couldn't say the words out loud. I stood pushing my chair back. Thank you for dinner, Mom. We'll see you soon. Grace didn't move. She didn't even try to stop us as Emily and I walked out the door together. Outside, the cold night air hit my face, and Emily exhaled shakily. She glanced at me, her voice quiet but steady. That felt like the first real step. I looked back at the house, the warm light in the windows, my father's shadow standing by the curtain. I squeezed Emily's shoulder. It was. And for the first time, I didn't just feel like I was fighting for myself. I was fighting for my family too, whether they were ready to see it or not. Dinner at my parents' house felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering over Seattle that night. The table was set, the smell of roast chicken filling the air, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Grace moved around the kitchen, pretending everything was normal. Richard sat at the head of the table, silent, his face unreadable. Emily sat next to me, her hands clenched in her lap. When we began eating, my mother broke the silence. "Olivia, you need to stop this madness. Drop the lawsuit. Forget the trip to Hawaii. It's not worth destroying this family." I put my fork down and looked straight at her. "This isn't revenge, Mom. This is about the truth." Grace's eyes flashed with anger. "Truth." She glanced at Emily. "What good is truth if it tears us apart?" Emily stiffened, but I spoke before she could. What tore us apart wasn't the truth. It was the lies Ethan fed us for years. My mother's lips tightened. "You sound just like him when you talk like this. Obsessed. Bitter." Emily's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood. "No, Mom. Enough. Olivia's right. You keep defending him because it's easier than admitting he used all of us." Grace's eyes widened in shock. "Emily, sit down right now." Emily's voice cracked, but she didn't sit. "No. I let him play me. I let him use me to hurt her. I won't keep pretending anymore. I'm going to Hawaii with Olivia, and you'll see for yourself who Ethan really is." The room went silent. My mother stared at Emily like she didn't recognize her. Then she turned to me, her voice trembling. "You're dragging her into this." I met her gaze, calm but unyielding. "No, Mom. She's walking in on her own." From the end of the table, my father finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and it cut through the room like a knife. "Let her go, Grace." We all turned to look at him. He had barely said a word all evening, but now he leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on me. Richard's jaw tightened, then he gave me a single nod. It was small, but it was enough. Grace looked between us, her hands trembling. She didn't say another word. In that quiet, Ethan's name lit up my mother's phone on the counter. She picked it up instinctively, her voice sharp as she answered. "Hello, Ethan." I could hear his smug laugh from where I sat. "Put me on speaker." Grace hesitated, but before she could refuse, Ethan's voice carried through the room. "So this is the family meeting I've been hearing about. Tell Olivia she's embarrassing herself. And Emily too, if she's dumb enough to follow her." Emily's hands balled into fists, but I didn't look away from the phone. I leaned closer, my voice steady and cold. "Tell him yourself, Emily." Emily glared at the phone, her voice shaking but fierce. "I'm not on your side anymore." There was a pause on the line. Then Ethan's laugh, sharp and cruel. "You'll come crawling back, both of you. After Maui, everyone will see who you really are, Olivia. You're a joke." I reached for the phone, my fingers tightening around it. "See you in Maui, Ethan." I ended the call without waiting for his reply. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace looked at me like I was a stranger. Emily sat back down, her hands still trembling, but her chin held high. "And Richard?" My father simply nodded again, slow and deliberate, like a quiet vow that he was with me, even if he couldn't say the words out loud. I stood pushing my chair back. "Thank you for dinner, Mom. We'll see you soon." Grace didn't move. She didn't even try to stop us as Emily and I walked out the door together. Outside, the cold night air hit my face, and Emily exhaled shakily. She glanced at me, her voice quiet but steady. That felt like the first real step. I looked back at the house, the warm light in the windows, my father's shadow standing by the curtain. I squeezed Emily's shoulder. It was. And for the first time, I didn't just feel like I was fighting for myself. I was fighting for my family too, whether they were ready to see it or not. The air inside the Honolulu courthouse was heavy with tension. Reporters lined the hallway outside, cameras flashing every few seconds as if they could sense the blood about to spill. I walked into the courtroom with David and Liam at my side, Emily just a few steps behind. For a moment, I felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down on me. Ethan, was already there. He sat at the defendant's table, perfectly composed in his tailored navy suit, his smug grin sharp enough to cut glass. Vanessa was beside him, her hand looped around his arm like she belonged to a world that would never collapse. When his gaze met mine, he smirked. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Franklin Lee was known for his precision and patience, and the way he looked down at the courtroom made it clear he wouldn't tolerate theatrics. David stood first. He was calm, deliberate, and every word he spoke was like a blade. Your Honor, the plaintiff moves to submit into evidence a certified DNA test proving that Ethan Reynolds has deliberately concealed the truth regarding paternity. Ethan shot to his feet, his voice rising. That's a lie. That test is fake and she knows it. Judge Lee raised his gavel and struck it sharply. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds. You will have your turn. The bailiff's stern gaze locked on Ethan until he lowered himself back into his chair, still seething. I didn't look away from him. I wanted him to see the calm on my face, the quiet certainty he had never been able to break. David handed the file to the clerk and brought it to the judge. The room held its breath as Judge Lee scanned the pages, his expression unfolded. After a long pause, he spoke. This report is verified by an independent laboratory and corroborated by the testimony of their lead analyst. It is admissible. Ethan slammed his hand against the table. This is ridiculous. She's doing this to humiliate me. The judge's gavel struck again. One more outburst, Mr. Reynolds, and I will hold you in contempt. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Madison, sitting behind me, leaned forward and whispered, This is it. I didn't move. I just kept my eyes on the man who once thought I would never fight back. Judge Lee turned to the clerk. Read the result. The clerk stood, her voice clear and steady. Based on the DNA analysis, there is a 0% probability that Ethan Reynolds is the biological father. The words crashed through the room like thunder. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked nonstop, and a dozen gasps rose from the gallery. Ethan's face twisted, his smirk finally breaking as he shot up from his chair. This is a witch hunt. You hear me? I will destroy every single one of you. The judge pounded his gavel so hard the sound echoed off the walls. Bailiff, remove him if he cannot control himself. Ethan froze. For the first time since this started, he hesitated. His lawyer yanked at his sleeve, forcing him to sit. He tried to recover, leaning back in his chair with a hollow laugh. You think this means anything, Olivia? You think this is over? I turned to Liam, who had been silent beside me the entire time. He leaned down, his voice quiet, but full of steel. He's finished, Olivia. He just doesn't know it yet. Ethan laughed again, louder this time, his gaze locked on me. Enjoy this little win. I'll see you in Maui. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at him. Instead, I gathered my papers, my hands steady, and whispered to Liam. Let him have his confidence for a few more days. Liam's lips curved into the faintest smile. It will make his fall that much harder. When the judge adjourned the hearing, reporters swarmed the hallway shouting my name and throwing questions like stones. I didn't stop. David shielded me with his briefcase, Liam stayed close enough to block the flashes, and Emily walked just behind me, her chin high despite the chaos. As we stepped out into the bright Honolulu sunlight, I drew in a slow, steady breath. The ocean air carried the scent of salt and promise, and for the first time in years I felt lighter. Ethan had just lost in a court of law. The next loss would be in front of the world. The air inside the Honolulu courthouse was heavy with tension. Reporters lined the hallway outside, cameras flashing every few seconds as if they could sense the blood about to spill. I walked into the courtroom with David and Liam at my side, Emily just a few steps behind. For a moment, I felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down on me. Ethan was already there. He sat at the defendant's table, perfectly composed in his tailored navy suit, his smug grin sharp enough to cut glass. Vanessa was beside him, her hand looped around his arm like she belonged to a world that would never collapse. When his gaze met mine, he smirked. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Franklin Lee was known for his precision and patience, and the way he looked down at the courtroom made it clear he wouldn't tolerate theatrics. David stood first. He was calm, deliberate, and every word he spoke was like a blade. Your Honor. The plaintiff moves to submit into evidence a certified DNA test, proving that Ethan Reynolds has deliberately concealed the truth regarding paternity. Ethan shot to his feet, his voice rising. That's a lie. That test is fake, and she knows it. Judge Lee raised his gavel and struck it sharply. Sit down, Mr. Reynolds. You will have your turn. The bailiff's stern gaze locked on Ethan until he lowered himself back into his chair, still seething. I didn't look away from him. I wanted him to see the calm on my face, the quiet certainty he had never been able to break. David handed the file to the clerk, who brought it to the judge. The room held its breath as Judge Lee scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he spoke. This report is verified by an independent laboratory and corroborated by the testimony of their lead analyst. It is admissible. Ethan slammed his hand against the table. This is ridiculous. She's doing this to humiliate me. The judge's gavel struck again. One more outburst. Mr. Reynolds and I will hold you in contempt. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Madison, sitting behind me, leaned forward and whispered, This is it. I didn't move. I just kept my eyes on the man who once thought I would never fight back. Judge Lee turned to the clerk. Read the result. The clerk stood, her voice clear and steady. Based on the DNA analysis, there is a 0% probability that Ethan Reynolds is the biological father. The words crashed through the room like thunder. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked non-stop, and a dozen gasps rose from the gallery. Ethan's face twisted, his smirk finally breaking as he shot up from his chair. This is a witch hunt. You hear me? I will destroy every single one of you. The judge pounded his gavel so hard the sound echoed off the walls. Bailiff, remove him if he cannot control himself. Ethan froze. For the first time since this started, he hesitated. His lawyer yanked at his sleeve, forcing him to sit. He tried to recover, leaning back in his chair with a hollow laugh. You think this means anything, Olivia? You think this is over? I turned to Liam, who had been silent beside me the entire time. He leaned down, his voice quiet, but full of steel. He's finished, Olivia. He just doesn't know it yet. Ethan laughed again, louder this time, his gaze locked on me. Enjoy this little win. I'll see you in Maui. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at him. Instead, I gathered my papers, my hand steady, and whispered to Liam. Let him have his confidence for a few more days. Liam's lips curved into the faintest smile. It will make his fall that much harder. When the judge adjourned the hearing, reporters swarmed the hallway, shouting my name and throwing questions like stones. I didn't stop. David shielded me with his briefcase. Liam stayed close enough to block the flashes, and Emily walked just behind me, her chin high despite the chaos. As we stepped out into the bright Honolulu sunlight, I drew in a slow, steady breath. The ocean air carried the scent of salt and promise, and for the first time in years, I felt lighter. Ethan had just lost in a court of law. The next loss would be in front of the world. The headlines came faster than I could read them. Every morning, my phone lit up with new articles, each one cutting deeper into Ethan's carefully crafted image. Samuel Price's latest piece didn't just expose Ethan's financial manipulation. It revealed how he had groomed and exploited Emily, twisting her loyalty until she couldn't see him for what he was. Public outrage exploded. Social media tore him apart. Former business partners started distancing themselves from him, and investors began demanding answers. For the first time, Ethan wasn't untouchable. He was cornered. I sat in my apartment with Emily as she scrolled through the comments under Samuel's article. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was something fierce in her eyes. People believe me, Olivia. They actually believe me. I placed a hand on hers. They see him now. He can't hide anymore. Liam called that afternoon. His voice was calm as always, but there was a note of satisfaction underneath. His shareholders are furious. I heard from a contact at the board. If this keeps up, he'll be fighting to keep his position. I leaned back in my chair and smiled faintly. Let him hold on to it. It'll make Maui that much sweeter. But Ethan, in true Ethan fashion, didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down. 2 days later, he held a press conference standing in front of a massive banner announcing his grand event in Maui. He smiled for the cameras like none of it mattered. He called it the ultimate celebration. When I watched it on television, I didn't feel anger. I felt something sharper. He was building his own gallows, and he didn't even know it. That evening, Liam came over with David and Madison. We spread documents and timelines across my dining table. Emily sat between us, her jaw tight but determined. David tapped a stack of financial statements. When this drops the morning of his party, the press won't just report on it. They'll tear him apart. Madison grinned. And the best part is he invited the press himself. Liam looked at me. You're ready for this. I nodded. I've been ready for a long time. The following days felt electric. Emily stayed with me most nights, and even my father started calling more often, his quiet voice steady in my ear. Grace, still stubborn, didn't say much, but she didn't fight me anymore either. Maybe the truth was finally sinking in. One night, as we were reviewing the final pieces of evidence, Emily turned to me. Olivia, do you think Mom will ever really forgive me? I paused, then set my pen down. Maybe not today, but she'll see what he did to you. And when she does, she'll stop blaming you. Emily blinked back tears, but she smiled. That's enough. On the morning before we left for Maui, I stood by my window staring at the city I had rebuilt myself in. Liam arrived in a black town car, and when I stepped outside, he was waiting by the door. He looked at me the same way he had the first night we met, steady and unshakable. This is it, he said simply. I glanced at Emily, who stood beside me holding her suitcase. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. We flew to Maui that afternoon. The ocean stretched endlessly below the plane, glittering under the sun, like it was daring me to take back what I had lost. As the island came into view, my chest tightened, not with dread, but with something closer to triumph. Ethan thought this party would save him. He had no idea it was going to destroy him. The night air in Maui was warm, carrying the sound of waves crashing softly against the shore. The beach was transformed into a spectacle of lights and luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung from elegant white canopies, and a string quartet played while waiters carried trays of champagne. Ethan stood at the center of it all, holding a microphone like he was hosting a coronation instead of his own downfall. He spotted me almost immediately. His grin widened sharp and mocking. Olivia Parker, look at you. I guess the only thing you managed to get in life was a rich man willing to save you. The crowd erupted in laughter, polite and cruel. I felt their eyes on me, measuring me, waiting for me to break. But I didn't move. Liam's hand slid into mine, steady and certain. He leaned close, his voice calm enough to cut through the noise. Are you ready? I looked up at him and nodded. Let's finish this. We walked forward together. Conversations faltered, laughter dimmed, and by the time we reached the stage, every eye was on us. Ethan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. When Liam joined me on the platform, his presence radiating the kind of authority that I had never seen. Liam took the microphone from Ethan with a deliberate calm. Thank you for the introduction, Ethan, but you forgot one thing. Ethan sneered. Oh, and what's that? Liam's voice carried easily over the crowd. This woman isn't here because she needs saving. She is here because she is the strongest person in this room. And tonight, everyone is going to see the truth. He turned to me, his hand giving mine one firm squeeze, and then he stepped aside. Samuel Price emerged from the crowd, a stack of neatly organized documents in his hands. The murmurs spread like wildfire. Everyone knew his name. He was the journalist who had been dismantling Ethan piece by piece in the press. Now he was here in person, and the sight of him made Ethan pale for the first time all night. Samuel's voice was cool, professional, and devastating. Ladies and gentlemen, you might want to pay attention. These are official records detailing financial fraud committed by Ethan Reynolds. Offshore accounts, bribed auditors, false reports filed to protect his empire. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones came out, cameras flashed. Ethan lunged towards Samuel, but David appeared out of nowhere, blocking him with the calm precision of a man who knew the law was already on his side. Vanessa, standing just behind Ethan, stared at the papers in disbelief. She pulled her hand from his arm as if he burned her. Ethan turned toward her, frantic. "Vanessa, don't you dare!" But she was already walking away, her heels sinking slightly into the sand, her face twisted in disgust. The crowd parted for her, their whispers loud enough to sting. Emily stepped forward, then her voice clear and sharp. "You ruined everything you touched, Ethan. And now you can watch it all collapse." He turned toward her, his jaw clenched. "You ungrateful little—" The words died in his throat when the crowd's laughter started. Not the polite kind from earlier, but raw and cruel. They weren't laughing with him anymore. They were laughing at him. I stepped closer, my voice low enough for only him to hear. "This is what you built, Ethan. And this is where it ends." His eyes darted wildly between the flashing cameras, the whispering guests, and Samuel's calm dismantling of every lie he'd ever told. For the first time, he looked small. Liam moved to my side, his presence grounding me. The humiliation was no longer mine. It was his, and everyone could see it. The sound of the ocean roared behind us, the music had stopped, and the only thing left was the sound of Ethan's world cracking apart under the weight of the truth. And I didn't look away. Not for a second. Ethan stumbled off the stage, his face pale, his jaw tight, and for once he didn't have a single word left to throw at me. The crowd parted around him, their whispers sharp enough to slice through the humid Maui air. He tried to hold his head high, but I saw it in his eyes. He was finished. Emily came to stand beside me, her hands trembling as she looked at me. Her voice was quiet, but raw. "Olivia, I am sorry. I saw everything tonight. I was so blind." I turned to her, my chest tight, but steady. "Stand up, Emily. Do not let anyone hold the strings to your life again." Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, and then for the first time in years, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. I held her, and for a moment the noise, the cameras, and even the waves faded. She was my sister, and maybe we were broken, but we were still here. Our parents came closer. Grace looked at me with tears glistening in her eyes, the kind of tears that carried both regret and pride. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder, firm and grounding. No words were exchanged, but I didn't need them. His nod said everything. Liam moved in beside me and rested his hand gently on my shoulder. "You did it, Olivia. You didn't just win. You won in your way." I turned to him and let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt the chains of Ethan's shadow fall away. Reporters pressed forward microphones, raised the flashing lights, nearly blinding. One of them shouted my name. "Olivia, what do you want to say after all this?" I looked out at them. The ocean behind me glimmering under the moonlight. The sand beneath my feet, solid and steady. If anyone out there has ever been torn down, humiliated, or told they would never rise again, remember this. Justice always finds a way. For a moment there was silence. Then the applause began slow, but growing, spreading through the crowd until it rolled like the tide. Emily's hand squeezed mine, and I felt Liam's steady presence at my back. Ethan's yacht lights faded into the distance, but I didn't watch him leave. He no longer mattered. I turned toward the horizon, where the sound of the waves met the hum of voices behind me. The ocean seemed to roar in agreement, like it had been there for every step of this fight, waiting for this ending. I smiled, small, but certain, and whispered to myself, "It's over." But as the cameras flashed and the crowd lingered, I knew this wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. If you have ever been pushed down, stay. Listen.